don't you start, give us an overview of what we're talking about.
Good afternoon. So I think the main purpose is that there are two letters that we're trying to move forward onto the agenda to charge admin and direct costs related to the ARPA projects. So in sum, they're $12.5 million. The one is 4.4 and the other is 8.1 million. So the admin cost is 4.4, the direct. So admin would be, for example, the budget office. I spend a fair amount of my time on ARPA. I'm not making any of the ARPA projects happen, but I am overseeing a bunch of it. So the admin portion would include a fraction of my salary. But I would not have any fraction of my salary be direct cost. Whereas Mary from engineering, who was here before, she would have a portion of her salary that would be direct cost. So I think part of the concern initially with the letter was that there was a lack of detail, and the letter kind of evolved to have more detail. So now there is a list that provides, so again, there's the two categories. There's the admin and there's the direct cost. So the direct cost, all of this, I would say, Joe Gorsuch, there's a lot that went into it, even though it may seem a certain way, but Joe met with basically all the departments to talk about how much time is your staff spending on these projects directly. And he got estimates of time and then used their salary and kind of overhead charges to get an estimate of what might be the direct cost over 4 years. And so that is essentially the summary of that is in the list that adds up to.
So if it's not used though, does it go back in the general fund?
If this isn't used?
If it's not all of them?
Well, so this would mean that, so right now we have the 123 ARPA, and really in theory, this 12.5 million is kind of being contributed in kind with the city budget. So you could say the cost of the ARPA is $135.5 million. But, or whatever, 123 plus 12.5, 135. And we're doing that now. We're just basically contributing in kind the value of my time, the value of Mary's time. And we're saying we want the option to be able to charge for those. And then, so both these letters outline that. And then I would just describe the difference for the admin function. Joe, so in the letter, I highlighted the estimated cost by ARPA project. That makes a lot of sense for the direct cost. Those numbers seem pretty good. But when you look at the admin cost, it's like a fixed cost. But that's because essentially we just took the total cost and divided by the number of projects and put it on a project. But the way that admin cost was calculated was based on the interviews with the admin functions, like budget, like law, like research, I guess. And so really you'd have to look at it that way. So I did just bring kind of the breakdown by all the admin departments so you could see the detail that way too. And then I'm gonna give you one just for budget to give you a sense of what the backup is. And I don't plan on giving you all this because again, it's all estimating, but it is just saying a lot went into getting the numbers that add up to 12.5 million. They're small.
Yeah, I don't have my glasses, so we can't see that. That's exactly what it is.
So this is, the top one is the budget office only. So essentially each of these things on the move.
Okay, so beat us in the submission.
So on the main page, it lists all the things like budget's the first one, API, communications, and then you see DPW, engineering. So some of them are not strictly admin, but when you look at just the administrative ones like budget, which I highlighted in blue, that's what eventually gets you to the 4.4 roughly $million. So like the budget office has almost $62,000 over the 4-year period. And if you look at the backup for budget, you could see that it highlights my staff, myself, and then it fills in an estimate of the amount of time we're going to work by year. So it says I'm going to spend 8% of my time in year 1 on ARPA. And then for the years after, it says I'm only going to spend 6% of my time. And it kind of does that for each person. So each of these offices have that sheet that was essentially filled in, that Joe made, that he filled it in when the respective department had. So it sums up into that. So I suppose you could say, why didn't we do this and put this in the 123 million? And we just didn't really think of it at that time. And we're trying to make a plan quickly to release. And at that point, the rules weren't all there, so how much of the admin, how much would we be able to charge for admin wasn't really established. But at this point, we don't want to stop any of the projects that are moving forward, but we do want the ability to charge. So it could mean that because we charge that $62,000 for the budget office, it means that the general fund is going to have $62,000 more at the end. So we will still be able to honor the commitments we've made in ARPA, but it just helps us provide the flexibility to charge it now and to spend the money faster, which I think is a strategic thing. With that, I can pause and just see what kind of questions there are.
Councilor Caldwell, do you have any questions?
Sort of, I'm just trying to understand it a little bit. So once we recoup this money, if we decide to recoup this money, what happens with the money?
What happens with the money? Well, it would basically just mean that we're charging, so we would be using less of the general fund. So I guess it would mean, for example, this year we're using fund balance to plug the gap that we have between our revenues. And so at first it would mean we use less of a fund balance. So it means our fund balance stays larger into the future. And then to the extent we shifted more than that, it would mean we spend less and it rolls into the fund balance. So really this is just, it's not like it goes somewhere where you're not going to see it. It's literally just going to minimize the expenses on our budget to help us preserve our fund balance into the future.
Once it goes into the fund balance, still coming from ARPA, does it have the same regulations to be used, or is it just more money in the
Well, so in theory, that's 62,000 for the budget office. If we charge that to ARPA and then we had it left over, the restrictions are gone. But I think we're just saying that we still have promised to do this other $62,000 worth of ARPA stuff, and we're going to do that regardless. So like this is an ARPA eligible charge, the 62,000 in budget, but so are the other projects that we've identified. So it's just kind of a toss up. It's a way to give us the ability to charge for it and to hopefully strategically charge faster so that we're not approaching the end of the ARPA term, which is a long period. Either way, it takes time to spend money. So we just think it makes sense that we have the flexibility to charge this way.
So the way I think about it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a helpful analogy, is imagine we budgeted for a position that was going to be $75,000 a year, and then we applied for a grant that was going to cover that salary. We had already budgeted for it, but now it's great. We don't have to spend that money of our general fund. We're going to use the grant money. And that's like roughly analogous to what we're talking about doing here.
Then, just to make sure I understood correctly, if it goes into the general fund, then it loses the ARPA regulation. It can be used for anything.
I just want to be really clear about that. So if we are using ARPA funding, the ARPA funding has to be used according to ARPA regulations. We've got two different ways ultimately that this funding is eligible for ARPA. If it's administrative, the federal government has told us we can spend up to 10% of our ARPA budget, which is about $12.3 million, on administrative costs. So for the $4.5 million bucket that Tim was talking about, it's under that 10% threshold, but we would have to report it as our administrative cost of our ARPA program. So there's a mechanism to do that. For the direct costs, those are eligible for ARPA in the same way that all of the other program funding itself is eligible for ARPA. So we've determined, for example, that it's eligible for us to spend $11 million to build new housing. So the direct staff cost to administer that housing program is eligible as well. So we have to basically follow either the administrative guidelines of ARPA or the programmatic regulations associated with ARPA to spend this funding. But we've already kind of done the analysis to say, essentially, this $12 million is an eligible ARPA expense for one of those two reasons. But we do have to report this spending to the federal government like we do for all the other ARPA spending. We have to make sure we're complying with all the regulations. Joe helps us with all of that, so we're not getting into hot water with our friends in Washington. But no, all of this would be subject to ARPA as well. Obviously, if we're using general fund to spend this money, that doesn't get reported to the federal government, and then these regulations don't apply. Does that make sense? Okay.
And just one other part on it is an estimate, so I think there's like totally sound methodology to what goes into the estimate, but the recording will have to be a bit different. So again, we made this point previously, but the administrative cost is kind of easier to charge because it's in general open, and I don't need to put, I spent 2 hours of my day doing ARPA stuff today on my timesheet for us to make that charge, but Mary would likely have to put, I spent 2 hours of my day working on this project in order to charge the direct cost. So anyways, the way in which we're gonna, even with the authority to do this, we still have to figure some of the things out, especially with regard to the direct cost for how we're going to like verify it was all real. So it could be different just in that way.
And Jen, you do that reporting, right, for ARPA, so when you go to report to them, easily enough to just report to us and it should all sync up easily. Yeah.
Other questions on this? No?
Not for me.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are we good with it?
I'm good with it.
I'm good with it. I never really.
Free money?
No, it's Councilor Rudd. No, Tim. Councilor Rudd, no. Greg, no. Greg.